All right, welcome into the RotoViz Best Ball Show. I'm Blair Andrews. Super excited to be joined by Shawn Siegele today. Shawn, we haven't had a chance so far this offseason to do a ton of these drafts together, so I'm really looking forward to this. How's it going?
Good. I'm excited to draft with you because, I have to say, the last couple of years, the co-managers that I have had the privilege to draft with have done very, very well. So that's always exciting. But you and I have had great chemistry, have had some excellent results in the main event, in the FFPC best ball tournament. And I think this could be the one. I think it could be the one. And I have some things I want to bounce around with you because you've got some very interesting rankings up top.
Yeah. It's always fun to draft with you because we do tend to approach these games pretty similarly. Our rankings are pretty similar, but I think there are a few points of disagreement that are worth, maybe not disagreement, but points we can hash out on this. One thing that always comes up when I'm doing these drafts is because my rankings, kind of like yours, are a little bit different than ADP. There's a little bit of a balancing act with drafting from your rankings versus trying to get some value. How do you tend to approach that?
Well, I've made the case on the Best Ball Banana Stand that I'm just not that worried about ADP values. Now, that's always within context, where basically you're trying to get as many of the top players that you have by your own rankings on one team as you can. And so understanding where players tend to go is helpful, right? We're not ignoring that element entirely, but I do think it's important to lean into your own strengths. And there's so much great research out there on ADP value and how it does, juice win rates and that type of thing. Advance rates, you want to advance, right? You want to get as many teams in as you can. And Jake Bose has done some fantastic research on that, even down to what positions you actually want to focus on in terms of ADP value and which positions it probably doesn't matter as much. So definitely check out the site for some of those. And I think Jake has some really cool pieces in the offing coming up very shortly. So subscribers will, I'm sure, be on the edge of their seats and will want to check those out. Having said all of that, I think that if you put such tight guardrails on yourself that you lose the creativeness that you would otherwise have, I should just say the creativity you would otherwise have when you're drafting, and you lose some of the fun and the enjoyment of drafting because you're basically like, well, who's the ADP value here? Then how does that fit into the next step, and then who do I have to draft in order to stack it and then game stack it? And you come in the end and you're like, well, by the things that work, this is a relatively strong team. By the things that we can objectively prove over and over that they're going to give you these small edges, this is a good team. But are these my guys? Did I enjoy the draft? And Blair, I do want to go back always to this idea of, are you having fun with it? Because most of your teams aren't going to win, right? You're paying money to enjoy the process. I do worry at times that in the race to do everything right and to accumulate all of these tiny edges, we lose some of the fun. And I think that if you're not having fun, you're not drafting as well. It's going to be very difficult, right? And one of the things that was kind of interesting in Michael Dubner's fantastic piece on what is more important, week 16, week 17, getting there in the first place. Again, one of the best pieces that you'll ever read on fantasy football, certainly on best ball, on Underdog, how you can win that tournament. One of the things that he sort of notes in there is that the best thing to do would just be to build a super team, but that's not really actionable advice. And while I do agree with that, and I understand exactly what he was talking about there, as he's working through all the different arguments, I guess the thing that I would throw out is that I kind of think that you can. And one of the ways that you would do it would be to lean into your rankings, lean into the player archetypes that we know outperform. And they're not going to always outperform. And sometimes they're going to give you holes. And so if you're worried about teams with holes on the roster, maybe you don't want to have fun, right? But I guess I do think that you can build super teams, and that's one of the things that we've done successfully at RotoViz in the past. One of the reasons that subscribers enjoy some of the uniqueness of our approach. And, if you can build a super team and have fun, then that's something I want to lean into.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of articles, a lot of data about getting the right structure, having the right number of guys, getting ADP values, all of that stuff. But you can forget at the end of the day, you do have to actually pick like actual players, and it kind of matters which actual players you're picking. And yeah, I mean that's I think where following the rankings pretty closely can be important. In terms of our rankings that we're going to have up on in the draft that we do soon, they're fairly similar, but there are some kind of interesting differences. We both have CD Lamb at the top right now. How controversial is it, do you think, that we both have McCaffrey at 4 instead of at number 1 overall? I mean, part of that, for me anyway, is that I know I want to be building these teams out pretty wide receiver heavy in the early rounds. Part of it maybe is a little bit just acknowledging that there's some cliff risk for McCaffrey, maybe more than these young wide receivers have. Although I still don't have a problem with him at 1 overall. But how are you kind of approaching that balance between wide receivers and running backs in this first round?
Yeah, when we look at McCaffrey and his potential to gap the other players at the position, and that's something that, basically the whole thing is based on. We've talked a lot through the years about contingency-based drafting, about the ways in which, value-based drafting will cause you some problems if you don't apply it correctly or if you're too rigid in terms of your thinking about it. But certainly, if the guy's going to go out there and outscore his position group by 6 points per game, then that player is extremely valuable. And CMC has the potential to do that or do some version of that, maybe not to the extent of 6 points, but in any given season. And the other guys who can probably do it are Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson. It is interesting here that you have Robinson 1 spot behind Gibbs. So you do have maybe 3 guys who could accomplish it. But the other thing when we're looking at CMC is that maybe Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson are the 2 guys who have the best chance of actually accomplishing it. And it's tempting, I think, to look at what he's done in that 49ers offense and think, okay, all of the concerns people had when he was traded to the 49ers haven't really come to fruition. The offense is so good and he's so dynamic that he's still able to score even with all the mouths to feed. And I think that that's the main thing that you do want to look at. At the same time, just because someone has done it in the past, and that's one of the interesting things that you can pull up in the game splits tool on the site, is you can see these situations where the actual game splits when teammates are absent, or maybe the important teammate for a receiver is there, quarterback situation, all that type of thing. You will have these 7-8 game splits at times that defy your expectations, or in many cases actually defy the logic of it, why things would work that way. And so it's tempting to say, well, this guy didn't need such and such, when the fact of the matter is that the result that he managed to put up was an outcome that is a tale, right? And so when you're looking through these types of things and you're thinking through the constraints that an offense with that many mouths to feed still gives you, then for me, when you put that in the context of what we need structurally, which is you just have to have the receivers in the first 6 rounds. Now, whether that's all 6 or 5 or 4, or even just down to 3, but anytime you don't pick a receiver, you have to have a very strong reason for it. And when your choices at the top are guys like Lamb, Chase, Hill, you've got some interesting order here that I love. When you have St. Brown in at 2, you have Garrett Wilson in as the wide receiver 4. Anytime that you're passing on those guys for a running back, there's almost no way to justify it. I mean, you would need something even more than Christian McCaffrey to make that work in contemporary best ball.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've seen kind of I don't even want to call it the robust RB, but like the hyper fragile builds have some success, especially in seasons where the wide receivers were going a lot earlier. It seems easier in the 2024 environment to build those kind of zero RB super teams like you were talking about. One way I find myself deviating from the wide receiver heavy builds a lot this year is when I am kind of trying to plan out my tight end room. And I love the teams I'm able to build that have like both Sam Laporta and Trey McBride, even though you have to sacrifice some wide receiver firepower to get both those guys. How do you balance kind of the elite tight ends this year, considering there's maybe not as many breakout options later?
The top guys are so strong. And I think that once you get out of that group, certainly once you get beyond the Njoku Ingram range, then, I mean, are there still names? I think that there are, even with all of the receivers in Chicago. Cole Kmet demonstrated last season that he is a very good player. You have, I think, a situation where someone like a Pat Freiermuth could be the guy who, emerges in Pittsburgh and you actually want above, some of the higher profile names. You even get really late in the draft, and I'm probably going to be completely wrong on this, but I continue to believe that Jatavian Sanders' production is actually the indicator for him and not the lack of athleticism that he demonstrated at his pro day. So there are a few names late. I don't think you have to panic in any way, shape, or form if you don't get the guys that you want. But I mean, I really like too early tight ends. And one of the elements with that is don't have a ton of teams with both Laporta and McBride, but I love that you're doing that. I do like to have one of those two guys.
Yeah.
And then a second player in that, Pitts, Kittle type of range. But for me, and obviously you have him ranked at tight end 8 as well. But again, where are things actually skewed in terms of the probabilities? Are you and I high enough on Brock Bowers that maybe we've priced in most of the upside and we're not considering heavily enough what the downside risks are for a rookie tight end, especially one who could be in a bad offense, one who could be a little bit covered up by having an alpha receiver who is so target dominant? I mean, I think we have to admit that that's a possibility. And at the same time with Bowers, you're talking about a guy who, he's a much better prospect than Sam Laporta. And is he going to be able to match that type of rookie season? Probably not, but there's actually a scenario where he combines the things that Pitts did as a rookie, that Laporta did as a rookie, that Gronk did as a rookie. I mean, I don't think it's impossible that Brock Bowers finishes as the tight end 1 in 2024. And so you've got to look at it from that perspective when you're saying, okay, I want one of the top 2 or 3, and then I want another guy from that first 8 or 9.
Yeah, that makes sense. We can get into, I do want to discuss some of our different rankings and how we're kind of approaching a few of these players specifically, but maybe we can get into that as we go into a draft. So, I say let's fire one up and see what we get. While you're doing that, I do want to, you mentioned the guys like Bijan and Breece Hall who are able to maybe gap the field. I think that in both of our rankings, we have Bijan going later than ADP. How willing are you in general to kind of reach ahead of your rankings to get a guy like that kind of at ADP, even though you might have him ranked lower?
He's in such a difficult spot because when he's going off the board there at 7, you still have that Breece Hall shot. In many cases, you're thinking that structurally Puka or Garrett Wilson will work better. But, as long as Amon-Ra St. Brown is gone, then I think that it does work. And one of the things that I probably will incorporate a little bit more heavily, or at least think through again, you want to continue to make sure that you are evaluating your rankings all the way through and not getting kind of anchored to a spot, or not really even a take, but just a way of thinking about two players against each other and how they fit there.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm looking at Bijan versus Hall, Ben made some great comments, I think, on the most recent episode of Stealing Bananas. And it, Blair, I'm not 100% sure when that'll come out because it's part of our shorts program where we did a 3-hour show yesterday. So even the shorts are not particularly short. But talking about how Bijan Robinson, based on what the Falcons want to do, is likely to stay on the field a ton. So even though Tyler Algier had a very good rookie season, goes for 1,000 yards, maybe you don't have as much, and it wouldn't even really be a committee, but how you split out the touches for Algier really does make a pretty big difference in terms of, where you have him, if it's 7 versus if it's 10. And people might be like, well, that seems like it's very close. But one of the things that Dubner also did a great job writing about last year was how you can make sure you manage your exposures to the early players, because early on, if you have these guys even slightly out of ADP order and you do actually still want to have them all, then having them out of ADP order can cause problems for you, because you then do end up with, a huge amount of Garrett Wilson or a huge amount of Puka, and you don't get the running backs. Maybe that's good, maybe it's bad, but you at least want to be intentional about how you're doing it. And so we worked through that. And I'm thinking about Robinson and then Hall and what the Jets have done with their backups. And one of the reasons that I felt like Hall was going to be a great play last year, even if you bought into what they wanted Dalvin Cook to do, is that offense with Aaron Rodgers, with his coordinator, when they were in Green Bay, the 1B or just maybe the straight 2 still actually had a ton of work, scored points. Now that they've added all these additional running backs, maybe we're in a situation where the Falcons' backfield is not going to be nearly as split as the Jets' backfield, in which case you probably have to have Bijan ahead of him, which again is what we're seeing from ADP, although they're very, very close. And so that part is interesting to me. I'm going to have to continually look at that as the season goes along to make sure I have Bijan in the right place if those are some of the contextual elements that we're working with.
Yeah. We're pretty optimistic about the Falcons offense now that they have hopefully a decent, competent quarterback at least, and competent offensive coordinator. But there are, some risks that might not be fully priced into Robinson's ADP. I'm not sure about Algier. Yeah. I guess the other thing to talk about as it regards these drafts is how much, Dubner's article was great for kind of looking at the relative merits of weighing week 16, week 17 correlations. In any case, you don't want to prioritize that over getting good players at good values, good rankings values. But how much is that something that you're looking at, especially later in drafts?
So the thing that I'm trying to make sure I keep in mind is I want to get sort of as many of these double values as we can. So the ADP value and the rankings value. Obviously, in many cases, you won't be able to get that, but that's something that we're considering. And then as we build these teams out and you do start to have certain favorites when you get into rounds 8 through the end, one of the things then is how do those favorites then create some downstream effects in terms of week 16 and week 17 that can be either good or bad. So does it end up pushing you like even more extreme in terms of your own personal takes that are maybe high leverage types of plays? So one of the things I did a lot last year with some of my favorite players is to lean into how much leverage you could get by being both unique and extremely potent by taking some players who were mispriced. And if that mispricing, at least to me, paid off, then the benefits were going to be very, very outsized. Mm-hmm. Well, as you then work through that, if you end up having a ton of exposure to plays that perhaps are unlikely in their own right, but unlikely in a way that you're going to benefit a lot more than you lose. If you do hit, that's fine. But once you start to stack them and you get a lot of unlikely things together, then your odds of them actually panning out start to drop and drop and drop. You want to at least be aware of that as you're working through it and not get so caught up in pushing the benefits or this idea that if I hit on this, I'm going to have outsized reward, and forget about how the risk gets worse when the week 16 and week 17 kind of pushes you further down this path of believing that things are going to happen that the rest of the market is sort of out on. So that would be the thing that I want to keep in mind as we go through. How are you addressing that issue?
Yeah, it's something that I kind of end up going back and forth on, but I agree with pretty much everything you said. I'm using it, as a tiebreaker in a lot of cases, but also trying to use those correlations more at the end of drafts too. Well, I almost end up using it as a justification to reach on guys I was going to take anyway and taking them a little bit earlier, which is probably not the best way to approach it. But it ends up, if it works out where it's a guy I want to take and he happens to correlate with another player I've already taken, that becomes maybe too attractive. All right, so the draft is underway. We have the 11th pick. So we'll see who ends up falling to us there. Are these rankings are they your rankings or our consensus rankings?
Well, Blair, these should be the consensus rankings, but you know how that works for me a little bit. There could always be some user error in here, but I do think that these are your rankings and my rankings combined. We have Gibbs at the top, London, Olave. What direction are you feeling?
I have Gibbs as a first round pick, but I don't think you do. I'm happy with London if you want to do that instead.
Well, we talked a lot about how you've got to have the receivers at the top, but we do go ahead and take Gibbs. This is probably a good opportunity for you to explain, probably again, I'm sure you covered this, but why you like Gibbs ahead of the fantasy wrecking ball that's going to be Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, I do like Robinson a lot. I feel, I had actually looked at my rankings and thought maybe I should flip those guys around, but now that we're into it, I'm probably not going to. I think Gibbs, obviously, that could be a much better scoring situation in Detroit. I think he still probably has the edge in terms of his receiving value, which matters less in Underdog, to be fair, but still, I think that's significant. And I can continue after we make this pick if you want. I think London is probably the top of my board. Just seeing if there's anyone else. What do you want to do here?
Yeah, London also at the top for me. I'll mention again the Stealing Bananas shorts and some concerns I do actually have about the Falcons. And yet London there is a lot of fun. The upside is huge. I think that we can be a little bit more confident in him than in Kyle Pitts. You want to get a lot of exposure to both. We have a situation here where to get the quarterback that goes with that play in Kirk Cousins, you're talking about QB 18 in round 12. That takes a lot of the pressure off of you. There are also some other names that you can actually pull out of the hat and make work there as well. I do think, Blair, that for me, and interestingly enough, I have an extremely high number of drafts out of the 10, 11, 12. Almost all of our best ball banana stand drafts have been out of that range. I guess I believe that the first round value stops with Puka. And so, we have a pick at the 1-2 turn. Ideally, what you're thinking there is that, you get 2 first round picks. I would argue that you don't really get
none. Yeah, that's interesting. I have, we'd have to look at how the rankings break out like that, because in ADP, you do have AJ Brown in the first round. You have Garrett Wilson in the first round. Those guys are going after Puka. I have it Garrett Wilson ranked ahead of Puka, and then AJ Brown not even in the first round. And I think your rankings are maybe a little pretty similar there. So we're talking about Wilson as a first rounder, and then Nakua as like the 10th player, and the 11 and 12 are more like second round values, is what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely kind of quibble about which of those guys at the end deserves to be in the first round. Gibbs is kind of borderline for me, and London as well. He has a lot of those risks you mentioned. So I don't think you're wrong about that.
In this particular draft, it's been pretty interesting. We still do have 8 running backs going in the first 2 rounds by ADP, but we have a stretch from Brandon Ayuk at the 205 to Devontae Smith at the 302 in this draft that is entirely wide receiver. This may end up being a bit of an avalanche draft. We have the Achievers drafting right ahead of us, one of our best friends in the community here, and he does go ahead and take Trey McBride. Obviously, his team is going to end up being super cool in the end. Blair, we get around to Zay Flowers and T. Higgins as the 2 players. Given that I have a lot of picks in this range, I have a huge exposure to these 2 players. I love them both here. Travis Etienne is the other person that pops up. Who do we like?
I think I like Flowers here, but I'm good with either of those receivers that you mentioned. Flowers would be my pick.
The other person who is in the mix would be Tank Dell. I'm moving over here to look at your particular rankings. You have him at the 212. That's a pretty aggressive ranking. I do like that. I think that the weird and unfortunate shooting has knocked him a little bit, even though he seems like that's going to be absolutely no problem. The Stephon Diggs acquisition has knocked him some. I think we should take him right here.
Yeah, I'm definitely good with that. I think when Dell was healthy last year, he was so good. Like with him still on the field, you wouldn't have Nico Collins having the kind of second half of the season that he did. And we would probably be thinking about these 2 guys a little bit differently. That said, I do really like Nico Collins a lot this year and think he should be going a little bit earlier than where he is. So I'm very bullish on most pieces in the Houston offense.
And this kind of naturally segues into this idea of Houston and Baltimore playing a massive shootout game at Houston in week 17. Once we had Flowers, it was pretty straightforward to select Dell there. They have a lot of guys going early, but when you have a pick here, again, in this 10, 11, 12 range, it's such a natural fit and allows you to overcome maybe some of the weakness of the picks in rounds 1 and 2. You've got these guys ranked as the 212 and the 301. So I have to think that as we kind of move into this portion of the draft, you feel pretty comfortable and excited about how we're doing value-wise, being able to get them at the 3-4 turn.
Definitely. Yeah. I love the way we've been able to get this draft, especially in what looks like an avalanche room. It's nice to come out with 2 of your favorite guys.
And so the Achievers have done not exactly what you mentioned, but they take Trey McBride and Dalton Kincaid, rounds 3, rounds 4. Kincaid goes ahead of Travis Kelce. That is how I have them ranked. Dalton Kincaid, somebody I kind of expect to be my highest exposure when the whole thing gets done. Although, having said that, since I first started making those proclamations, his ADP has jumped a decent amount. It's going to make it much harder to do, but he seems like the focal point of the Buffalo offense. Blair, we talked in the introduction that we wanted to get 2 of these tight ends. Now Kyle Pitts goes 501. He's someone who has an ADP of 601 and so would have in theory come back to us. Are you starting to get nervous about our ability to execute the tight end portion of our thesis?
I mean, it is a little concerning to see all these guys go off the board pretty quick. I think there are probably some players we like who should make it back, and if necessary, we can reach for some of our favorites, although that's not ideal. But yeah, this is an interesting board, both aggressive for wide receivers and for tight ends. A very RotoViz esque board in that way. I love the team that Achievers is putting together here with the two elite tight ends and Garrett Wilson. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if we can get some of our guys here.
So we are now 4 picks away. I will move us back to the tab here where you can see the players available. I didn't give you that the last time through.
That's all right.
Kittle, somebody who is starting to sneak up, and he has a mid 6th round ADP.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about some of the potential concerns for Christian McCaffrey. Do those extend to Kittle for you, or is he the kind of massive upside play that you actually really like in this range?
No, I do really like Kittle in this range. I think he gives us, not only that massive upside, he also gives us some Week 17 correlation with Detroit, which is a kind of a nice thing to have. So love Kittle here.
And how are you looking at that Detroit-San Francisco game? I assume that, like everyone else, that one jumped out to me. You've got the replay of the NFC Championship game, which in large stretches, certainly that first half, dominated by the Detroit Lions. It does seem like a game that could shoot out. So before we get to that, we're back up. Jordan Addison, JSN, 2 names that I don't feel like you should get second-year breakout wide receivers at these prices.
Yeah.
But Brock Bowers also here, may not come back around, although he usually does. What's our priority?
Well, we have, let's see, our next pick after this is 83. So we might need to take, let's take Addison. I was going to say we might need to take JSN if we want to get him, but I do feel good about getting Addison here and not reaching almost 2 full rounds for JSN, even though I do love him. I probably have him on there we go. Yeah, see? Knew he wasn't going to get back around.
So
Good
the
pick.
Achievers also knew that he wouldn't get back to them. Go ahead and grab him there. How are you looking at those 2 guys? Because one of them is going to get probably a mix of Sam Darnold, although hopefully only for a game or 2, if at all.
Yeah.
And then JJ McCarthy. I have said about McCarthy that I think we have to understand that him being a game manager in college doesn't give us a sense of what he'll be at the NFL level. I think he's either going to be someone who, because of his age and his arm talent, breaks out and is a star, or busts. I mean, he's not really the kind of guy where I think you're going to be able, because the NFL is just so different. You don't have Michigan's ability to dominate all of your opponents in the trenches and not have to worry. That's one of the things that we saw with Trey Lance, is that you go to the NFL and being on a team that was utterly dominant, so you don't have to throw the ball, that's not something that you can replicate, right? Now, other teams out there who have game manager-ish types of QBs, and could Bo Nix end up being a bit of that for the Broncos? I mean, maybe, but the thing that you're looking at with McCarthy, and the reason that he generated the enthusiasm, was that when he needed to make throws, and again, this is kind of a controversial statement, but arguably he did. And you take that, you put it with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison in a situation where maybe the defense is rebuilding a little bit. I guess I think we're going to see fireworks, or we're going to see a guy who looks a little bit Zach Wilson, Bryce Young-ish. I don't think you're just going to see this bland offense where they're able to rely on the running back. And for me, that means that Jordan Addison is wildly underpriced. You contrast that with JSN, who is underpriced for different reasons, but also has kind of a weird QB dynamic and has more competition for targets. Which guy do you prefer?
Well, I think, I agree with everything you just said. I have JSN way higher than his ADP, but I also have Addison higher than, or earlier than his ADP as well. The the target competition for JSN probably is the main reason he's not going earlier. And I think you do have to kind of take that into consideration because Metcalf is still a good player. And even if you expect JSN to take the next step, he's still competing with players who have shown they can do it. They can earn that volume. Lockett, of course, being the other guy. I mean, contrast that with Addison, who's competing with targets for Jefferson and Hawkinson. Maybe there's not that much of a difference there in terms of the target competition. And then you'd prefer Seattle's kind of offensive situation. I have Addison ranked a little bit higher. Partly that's a reflection, I think, of the ADP. Kind of don't want to go too far outside of that. Don't want to tell people to draft JSN in the 3rd round or something, even though maybe
even though you should, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So Blair, as we work back around here, the receivers have continued to go off the board. We got Dunze, Godwin, Coleman, Ridley, Brian Thomas Jr., McConkey, Watson, Hopkins, Rashee Rice, Deontay Johnson, all gone. Our combined board doesn't have any wide receivers for Miles, which is kind of nice in terms of our build here. We're able to get the 4 early receivers, and 3 of them are second-year guys. So I think it's just an absolutely perfect fit roster-wise for what you and I like to do, and who got back around.
Yep. I think we probably can't risk him making it back to us on the turn because the 112 drafter does not have a tight end yet. So let's take Bowers here.
We get David Montgomery. Jameson Williams was actually the next receiver in that group for us and would have been interesting given that we have some Lions 49ers going, but that's no longer a possibility. It is running backs here. We don't really have a need for Joe Burrow, who's our top guy.
Yeah.
Who should we take?
I think I like Brooks here. He's the top guy on our board, and pretty excited about, even though there are obviously still question marks about that offense. If Brooks is someone who's able to catch passes, you can see him having at least a lot of receiving volume in an offense that is maybe less functional than we'd like. But there's also, I think, a chance that you would have Bryce Young taking a step forward with all the weapons they've added between Leggett and Brooks and Sanders. Maybe that's not the most likely outcome, but there is some upside there.
So with several QBs still hanging out ahead of him, the Achievers do pass on Kyler Murray despite having both Harrison and McBride. That is an interesting one there. Something that I also like to do a lot, which is to push the QBs and see what does happen. The Cardinals have the Rams in week 17, which I think could be one of those sort of sneaky shootout opportunities. I do like playing that game. We have Baltimore and Houston together. We have Detroit and San Francisco together. We now have a little bit of Las Vegas on the roster. Jacksonville and New Orleans are the 16 and 17 for them. Those offenses, especially once Chris Olave is gone, are maybe not the teams you're really looking to do that much with. Opposite Jonathan Brooks, you have Tampa Bay in week 17.
Yeah.
So Blair, I'm not seeing a lot of pressure on us to force anything from a stack or game stack perspective. Currently, that Falcons situation is the one that's kind of hanging out there where you have the Washington Commanders. It's also fun because that week 16 And with a smaller pod, it probably matters a lot less. And yet, I think the New York Giants are one of those teams I'm going to have a ton of this season because the prices do not reflect the upside. Now, do they reflect the fact that those guys could all be holes? It certainly that is true, and that is the case. The prices are really emphasizing that portion of it. Other than you have Malik Neighbors going in the middle of round 3. Now, Blair, you and I have him a lot higher. You still feel more comfortable with his pre-draft ADP, even seeing him there with Daniel Jones.
Yeah. I mean, Daniel Jones is someone who is maybe not the most exciting quarterback, but he has been able to put up some decent games a few times. He's also not necessarily had the best weapons throughout a lot of his career, I think, or through a lot of the recent seasons. So I do think Neighbors can still have a really good season there with Jones. I think he elevates Jones a lot and elevates that whole offense. So I am excited for Neighbors for sure. I like taking Jones in the kind of near the final rounds, and there are some late Giants wide receivers that I certainly like to get. As regards the Achievers quarterback situation, he did tell us the race to Daniels was on. So we obviously...
Well, he's in better position for the race. We're in trouble.
He is, unfortunately. We obviously have that Week 17 game against Daniels in Drake, London. I believe Washington plays... well, I don't know. He's just going to take Daniels and see what he gets.
As you should.
Right, exactly. You don't need to correlate him if you don't want. Although there are some interesting Washington receivers later too that I think can make sense with a Daniels build, even if you haven't gotten, an Atlanta guy or a Philadelphia guy or something. There he goes, Daniels off the board. I mean, with the way quarterback is going, I don't think we need to reach for someone like Purdy on this team. So I'm happy with Chase Brown for sure.
Now, Blair, looking at the overall board and knowing that we didn't get Daniels there, do you regret passing on Lamar Jackson at the 5'11"?
No, I don't regret passing on Lamar Jackson there. I think I'm happy we were able to get Kittle instead. I think we still have a lot of outs with QB. This is a little bit, maybe a little bit early for Spears, but I do like him, so I'm happy with that.
Do we want to go with the ADP value? Do you have a preference between Mostert and Connor?
I probably prefer Mostert, but doesn't matter.
Oh,
just made it. Whew. Quick
at
fingers.
0.01 second. There.
Nice.
So, Blair, that was kind of that tension between ADP value, where you can get a 15 pick value, or rankings value, where we like Spears. He's probably the one player in that offense that I think can overcome the potential difficulties of a Will Levis-led team. He was absolutely electric last season. Tony Pollard struggled badly. Are there things that we're not fully valuing or thinking through when we look at this? Because ADP on these two players, you have Pollard going at the 809 and then Spears at the 1102.
Yeah.
When you look at, these are players that the team has said are redundant, players that are, similar in terms of what they bring from an explosiveness standpoint if they both are playing their best. But one of them actually played their best last season and the other one was awful. Why is the one who was awful going so much earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I assume kind of because of the role Pollard had in Dallas last year, the assumption for most fantasy players is that Tennessee brought him in to play that same kind of role, which we saw him struggle in. So from that perspective, it doesn't make a ton of sense that they would want to use him the same way. I think they should be going much closer. I think in both of our rankings, we probably have them flipped. So yeah, I definitely love Spears. Of course, he's not going to get back to us in the next round, but I would have been happy to reach a few rounds for him, or not a few rounds, but a few picks. But yeah, I think Mostert is actually kind of, in some ways, he's a similar sort of bet on a backfield that's, well, actually a backfield that's a lot more intriguing from a scoring perspective. But should probably be going closer to where his more highly drafted teammate in Achane is. Although I do like Achane a lot this year too.
And when you think about that, Jalen Wright, when we had a lot of analysts on OT talking about these running back prospects, there were a lot of questions about Wright. And then when he goes to the Dolphins, you're like, well, those questions probably don't matter because they're going to open these holes and he's going to run through them for 40 and 50 yards. We had to decide between Mostert and Connor there. Connor gets Trey Benson dropped in, but it's a two-man backfield. The Dolphins probably create more total running back value, potentially a lot more. And yet there are three guys. How much does the 2 versus 3 come into play when you're thinking about taking an ADP value? Because Connor and Mostert, probably are not guys that you draft at ADP, even, having made the argument that Mostert should be going earlier.
Yeah.
How does that 2 versus 3 work for you?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and that's true. I don't even like taking Mostert ahead of ADP, even though I have him ranked, I think, ahead of ADP. But it depends, of course, on the offensive situation, like you mentioned. I mean, in Miami, we'd expect, even with 3 guys, they could create as much value for each of their backs as many other offenses could for 2 or even 1 in some cases. Arizona, I think there's still a lot of question marks about how efficient their offense is going to be. Obviously, they had Harrison this year, which should help a lot. Kind of getting another full season of health from Kyler Murray helps a lot. Trey McBride taking a big step forward at the end of last season and carrying that over will help a lot. Will help the running backs a lot. So I'm optimistic for Benson, and I think Connor should have a good season as well. But there just seem to be so many points available for the backs in Miami every year. So that's a situation I want to have pieces of.
As we come to this pick, at least this turn, it's probably a situation where we need to take Cousins. The 4 players that I have kind of in the queue for us, any of those 4 guys versus Cousins, do you like Cousins before the wrap, after the wrap?
I think I would take Cousins here as well, even though he's, not necessarily a priority on most teams. I think I like all the other guys in the queue, but I think I'd be happy with most of them. Whereas I don't want to lose a QB that fits so well with this team.
So now we have Cousins. We are set up with a ton of flexibility with the 2 tight ends. We have the 4 early receivers, including 3 second-year guys. We have a running back group that you could arguably just stop with the 4 players, although we'll probably select another one.
Yeah.
Wide receiver is probably the priority. You just wrote about Troy Franklin being the steal of every draft. He might come back around. Leggett is the player in terms of ADP and rank. Any other things we should be thinking about here?
Yeah, I mean, you have Mims there by ranking. He's definitely going to make it back. I think I would probably take a chance on Franklin coming back at this point and take Leggett. but that's tough.
So I've been getting a decent amount of him based on where we have him ranked versus ADP. Now, in terms of this particular draft, we get him more or less right at ADP. We're into the phase now where, because of the avalanche elements early, we're starting to see a rebalancing because the teams who really loaded up don't necessarily need to push receiver. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the case that we're still in a situation where taking someone 4 picks ahead of ADP actually represents a value, but you could potentially make that argument. I do kind of like this, even though some of the teams are teams where, like Minnesota, perhaps, for example, I think you want to sort of pick out your guy with JJ McCarthy pulling the trigger and say, well, this is going to be the guy who benefits based on this particular team that we're building. Obviously, you have Justin Jefferson, and it's easy to make the case that he would benefit. I think that if we have Jonathan Brooks here, it is the right team to go ahead and take Leggett and kind of make the bet that Bryce Young looks completely different in year 2. And he was much, much worse than Trevor Lawrence was in his rookie season. And yet a similar type of blossoming in year 2, I think we would probably get actually a bigger difference in terms of how that manifested, right? So if you make the case that he's going to succeed as a QB, it probably has to happen this year. And if it does happen, then I think it's not going to necessarily be a jump to, well, even a jump to below average, I think would make these teammates at their prices work. But we could easily see it be a jump to average or slightly above average, in which case the Carolina pieces are going to be players you can win with based on the valuations. Is that the way you're seeing this? Or are you pretty uncomfortable that we already have 2 Panthers?
No, I think the prices on the Panthers are good enough that it's a bet worth taking. It's interesting because the way I'm kind of looking at it is this is a good kind of litmus test for whether you're talking about week 17, week 16 correlations versus trying to kind of optimize for the regular season, if that's possible. Carolina versus Tampa Bay in week 17 is not necessarily a game you'd expect to shoot out. You'd think in most scoring environments in that game, Leggett and Brooks would be negatively correlated. So you might actually want to avoid having them on the same team if you're trying to optimize for a single game. Whereas if Bryce Young takes a step forward, if Leggett is good, or if Leggett is good and the passing offense is good, that's going to be good for Brooks. From a season-long perspective, you can definitely see scenarios where both of these guys have good seasons and outplay their ADP.
And as we are thinking about the full team dynamic, then, is there anybody from the Buccaneers that you like late? I certainly don't want to force the late correlations. Bjorn had some great research on, how that potentially works. Certainly, I think a lot of the stacking benefits that you see are still mostly when you're stacking elite receivers with elite quarterbacks. And basically you're just like, well, we got multiple guys who are really good and that looks good together. The last 2 players before are the 2 we were kind of targeting in Miller and Franklin. Kind of an odd group here, although Irving, Vital, and Tracy, especially Vital in terms of ADP, is interesting. You mentioned Mims as a guy here. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'd probably go with the ADP value or closest to it and take Vital here. And Irving, obviously, with that Tampa Bay Carolina game could be interesting, but I think there are some names later who will also fit, who are also pretty interesting. So we don't have to get that. At this point, with 5 running backs on the board already, are you thinking we should probably go receiver here?
Yeah, and so for me, it's kind of that question of Mims versus just going ahead and getting Wandale.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's Wandale by ADP makes it back to us at our next pick, or does he? I think so. But, in this room, who can say? I'm good with either.
We have to make at least one pick to block off the Achievers, who's going to be able to pick twice before we got another shot at it. Right. And Blair, we now have the week 16 portion of the matchup, at least for our Drake, London, Kirk Cousins build. It does introduce another potential QB option for us late. We now have both Leggett and Robinson, their QBs, likely to be there at the very end of the draft.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I like the way this team is set up. Just see Mayfield go off the board there. He's not something I'm prioritizing, but probably doesn't make sense on a team unless we're definitely getting a Tampa Bay receiver. But there are a lot of interesting QBs I think we can get here.
So in round 14, Rodgers and Mayfield do go. Ben Sinnott goes. He would have been an interesting pick, I believe, if we hadn't gotten the two early guys. So he's kind of the other name that we're looking at late, and especially when you have Drake London earlier, he is sort of the late draft out. We have 4 picks. We only have the one QB, and we still are just at 6 receivers. What are you thinking for positionally things that are priorities as we go down the stretch?
Yeah, I think definitely QB and receiver are priorities. I'm happy stopping at 5 running backs. I don't think we need to take another tight end, but I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it. I think one interesting discussion to have is whether we want to do 2 QBs or 3 QBs on a team like this where we have just that one window QB and then we're looking at some later guys. 3 probably makes sense. I think there is some interesting data suggesting that 3 QBs might outperform in the playoffs in this format. So, I kind of waffle on that 2 versus 3 QB question. Where do you come down?
I like both, which is a cop-out answer, but I think that when you can save the roster spot, you want to do it. I also think that if you can simultaneously manage your capital allocation and create the extra pathway that you want to consider that aspect. And, if you get the one window-ish QB and then guys at the very end, you've really accomplished multiple objectives that both are very important for initial advance and then for providing not really a trump card, but again, some additional pathways in the playoffs that a lot of teams that have otherwise accomplished the overall structural objectives that you want, maybe you don't have.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any positions that you think, obviously receiver and quarterback, we would like to shore up a little bit. Are you thinking you would like to take another running back or another tight end with one of these final picks?
Only if we end up with a screaming value in that direction.
Yeah.
And so kind of moving back over here to our queue, Baker and Walker are the compelling receivers remaining. I think Jalen Hyatt, if you end up with Daniel Jones, is sort of a fun pick there. You end up getting a little bit more loaded up with Giants.
Mm-hmm. Early Bo Nix pick from the Achievers.
Absolutely love it. Love it.
Yeah, I'm good with either Baker or Walker. No strong preference between those. I mean, I actually probably do have a preference, but the ADP value means I can usually get both. So do you think having Baker on this team now puts Drake May in play as a possible quarterback? Or is that too thin?
Yeah, we'll add him to the board as well. I think we should have taken Walker. That would have been the fun play to go with Zay Flowers, to go with Tank Dell. But that also opens us up to take a QB here. So we get one of the three guys at the very least. It's probably the most likely that Bryce Young goes. Want to go ahead and take him here?
Yeah, that sounds good.
So in the big moment of silence there a moment ago, I was looking at how we wanted to try and build out Walker and the QBs, what order we needed to take those players in. He goes, making it less of an issue. I do like getting some Baker here, however, because I'm going to end up with so much Tez Walker. We discussed, a variety of the reasons that he could be the guy. But the difference between these two players is that Walker, even if he hits, is going to be the number 3 and a number 3 in an offense that may not have elite passing volume. If you get a situation where the Patriots do take the next step this year and Drake May is the starter at least by midseason and is playing well, Javon Baker could be their number 1. The competition for him there is not difficult. He's the third guy off the board from this group behind Douglas. Well, I should say he actually goes a little bit ahead of Douglas here, but it's kind of the assumption that you have Jalen Polk, who goes in round 13, and then Douglas maybe is the two guys who are most likely to hit. And you go back to rookie minicamp, and Baker was continuing to drop passes, which is something that he had trouble with last year in college. I pointed out that if you have a vertical guy who doesn't have elite speed, that's also a little bit of a red flag. But when you're looking at production and you're looking at price, when you can get a potential wide receiver 1 in the 16th round, I mean, he's going to be a guy that you need to have on your radar, because Blair, one of the things that has jumped out so clearly to me so far this year is that there just isn't a lot of price pressure on these builds, right? You can get those 4 early receivers. You can get the 2 tight ends. You can build a late-ish round running back group. No, we did take Gibbs in the first round, so we don't want to ignore that selection there. But when you can get Gibbs, Brooks, Brown, and Mostert and still feel like you were able to accomplish the other objectives, you didn't have to spend that much. These drafts are a lot of fun because in some ways they feel so easy. Now, it's not easy from the perspective of saying, oh, you're going to win the league or you're going to win the whole thing or anything to that effect, but you are able to accomplish the objectives that you have. And yet, after you get those 4 early receivers, you do have to come back around then and fill out with names who could hit, who aren't just, wild, crazy swings that don't do anything for you. I think that when you have Leggett as a potential number 1, although you would expect it to be Deontay Johnson, when you have Baker as a possible one of the things that I've mentioned from time to time is that reporting out of New York suggests that they think that Wan'Dale could, not that they think that he'll win, but could put pressure on Neighbors to be the target leader or the receiving leader with the Giants. I think that his price is one of the very best that you get in the entire draft. Do you like this group of receivers? Is that the way you're looking at it too, where once we're moving back to receiver later in the drafts here, we do have some guys, and if you are precise in terms of those selections, you're going to end up having the depth you need at receiver?
Yeah, exactly. I like that we got all of these these guys on offenses that are pretty wide open in terms of the wide receiver depth chart. All high upside bets. Definitely the way I like to play the receiver position. All right, we can take Daniel Jones here. Obviously, that's a good fit. We could take May. I'm happy with any of the quarterbacks in the queue. You added Trey Palmer at the bottom. I think another name that maybe to consider for that Tampa Bay stack would be Jalen McMillan if you have any interest in him. I also love Hyatt, obviously, so I'm good with any of those guys.
Has your Hyatt enthusiasm calmed down at all? As obviously, in general, people don't have much interest.
Yeah, it has a little bit. I mean, when they drafted Neighbors, obviously that probably hurt his value a bit. I'm still a big Wandale fan. Hyatt, you'd have to think is kind of competing for at best wide receiver 2, but probably he's the wide receiver 3. But yeah, I still think he has some upside that I'm happy to get in the final round.
And so thinking about McMillan, he did actually go at
Interesting.
1706. So he won't be an option for us there. Neither will Douglas, who may be less interesting after we picked Daniel Jones instead of Drake May.
Yeah.
But he also does go there. So I think this is pretty clearly Jalen Hyatt.
Yeah, I agree.
Blair, 3 QB, 5 running back, 8 wide receiver, 2 tight end. How do you like our build?
Yeah, I love this build. I think this is kind of perfect way to do a 5 running back team where you get one really early and then you can kind of fill it out with some later high upside guys. I love that we were still able to get the 4 top wide receivers and get 2 tight ends who, even though they're not necessarily in that elite tier in terms of ADP, they certainly have the ability to get there by the end of the season. So you talk at the beginning about building super teams. This certainly looks like a way to be able to do that. So yeah, I'm thrilled with how this team turned out. Obviously, we're hoping for some kind of maybe uncharacteristic play from Bryce Young and Daniel Jones, but certainly we think they have the weapons now on their team to really take the next step. So I'm excited.
When we look at this squad, we have some interesting Week 16 elements, which, as anybody who's read Dubner's article knows, is very important. And Blair, one of the other things that I kind of think about a little bit here is that I was able to get quite a few teams into the semis last season, and then taking that next step into the finals, very, very difficult. And as, again, you guys pointed out in that article, you don't project to get teams into the finals very often. I think that kind of emotionally sort of pushes you in the direction of saying, yeah, maybe I do want to emphasize Week 16, because if I could just get into Week 17, I would almost feel like, you're playing with house money at that point.
Yep.
And we know that, again, they flatten the structure and you get into Week 17 and your chances in a variety of ways to, pull off a decent payout are pretty good. How are you looking at this compared to the Week 17 element, where we don't have the game stack set up, but we do have the 3 QBs? And we have 3 QBs in a situation where I don't think that their Week 17 opponents are that compelling. I don't think that those teams and quarterbacks will be game stacked nearly as frequently as many other teams. And I don't think that forcing game stacks in these types of games are necessarily the way to play it, because we've given ourselves the 3 pathways. We don't need to then at the same time weaken the team by forcing players from bad offenses on the other side of that. Do you agree with that, or is some of that just an excuse for not having executed those game stacks?
No, I do mostly agree with that. I think, especially with the flatter payout structure, you do have to start looking at Week 16 as maybe being the more important week. I think there were even arguments in past seasons that week 16 was more important than people were perhaps realizing. So when you get a payout structure that really kind of leans into that a little bit more, that makes sense to start prioritizing week 16 over week 17 even, and perhaps looking for ways to get into the finals, to get that next step and actually just get a team in, at least get back all your money that you spent entering 150 lineups with even one of those last place finishes in the final round. I think that's obviously, you'd like to finish well, but to be able to come out of a tournament like this, even being profitable, is something I think to be pretty happy with.
I love the way this team turned out. I especially love it when you consider that we were battling the achievers the whole way through. Their team, of course, also a lot of fun. It ends up with Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, and Bo Nix on top of everything they did in the first 7 rounds, where they had 5 receivers and 2 super power tight ends. They get Jaden Daniels. Blair, how much different would this team have been if we had been able to win the race to Daniels? How do you like Kirk Cousins? Do you feel like there was opportunity cost there? I guess as I'm looking at it, I kind of always prefer someone other than Kirk Cousins. And yet, once we've taken Drake London, Kirk Cousins was having a great season last year before he got hurt. Those two things fit together. I mean, if you're telling that Drake London story as opposed to going out and just telling a Marvin Harrison story, for example, or reaching for someone like Chris Olave, I mean, you're kind of set there. And then again, I do love that week 16 game with the Giants.
Yeah.
I'm already now feeling how this particular roster is going to influence some of my future rosters in terms of that Falcons, Giants game stack. And it is an example that I mentioned sort of in the intro, where I think you want to be aware of not getting too caught up in maybe some of the lower likelihood outcomes and thinking that, now, the Giants are going to definitely hit. Where are you with the quarterback decisions that we made at this point, now that you get to look back at the whole thing?
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with the quarterback decisions we made. Like you, I'm not usually taking Cousins on a lot of these teams unless I have, already taken London basically. But even then, I prefer not to reach for him. But I think, given our quarterback situation and the way we were able to build out that week 16 stack with Daniel Jones and the Giants receivers, I really do like Cousins on this team. One thing I'm now noticing is that Bryce Young and Daniel Jones have the same bye week. So I don't know how much that matters to you on a 3 QB team. Obviously, that on a 2 QB team could be a thing you definitely want to avoid. On a 3 QB team, we do still have Cousins for that week 11. But how much does that bye week matter to you?
I don't think it matters too much. We do look in terms of the wide receiver group here, a lot of week 11 buys, a lot of week 14 buys. So those 2 weeks, we will be down players. Certainly, you need to have the spike weeks kind of balanced in such a way that you score well enough to advance. That's one of the things that came out of Dubner's article as well, is just, and this is something that Mike Leone has also mentioned pretty consistently in his manifesto, and then in discussing the underdog format, is just to remember you can lose a lot of these other minor advantages and still come out ahead in terms of your overall financial expectation if you get a lot of teams through. And so don't lose track of that. And that kind of wraps back into my comment at the beginning of having fun and trying to build super teams and getting teams through. So I think, ideally we'd have the buys spread perfectly, but the tight ends are week 9, week 10. You'd love to get big scores from both of them that week to get them into the flex. We also have only the one running back with a bye that week. Where staying healthy matters. Getting a full or full-ish roster late into the season matters. I think unless we get kind of strafed by injuries in the first half, I don't think those are going to be issues.
Yeah, I agree. I think this team is set up well to be able to weather some of those bye weeks with some of our early picks avoiding that week 11 bye. Obviously, we have Flowers and Dell both with the week 14, but by then we should have enough guys able to put up points that we should be in good shape. So I really like the way this turned out. All right, awesome. Well, thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you to Achievers for hopping into this draft, and anyone else who was following along and drafting with us. We appreciate you leaving us some of our guys. Anything else to touch on before we get out of here, Shawn?
We'll just mention again that we've got some great pieces coming out shortly from Connor. He's going to have some great stuff on FFPC for you and how you can use our rankings versus ADP to beat that format. You had mentioned that Jake Bowes has some cool work on the horizon. I'm going to be transitioning a little bit from Dynasty to Best Ball over the next couple of weeks. I'm excited to put out my priority targets and look at some early zero RB rankings, kind of early summer rankings before we get the big rankings in August. Lots of great stuff going on across the RotoViz radio pods. Appreciate everybody listening.
Definitely. Yep. Definitely make sure to check out all that great work coming up. Check out all the RotoViz radio podcasts. Shawn's got a lot of awesome stuff coming with Ben and with Colin. So and tune in next week. I don't know who the hosts will be. We have a rotating host for this show, but perhaps Colin will be back with some special guest. And we'll see you next time. Remember to subscribe and like and all that good YouTube stuff. And thanks for tuning in.